Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of IS4, the Indonesian Social Science Seminar Series. This is a virtual series we began early in the pandemic that brings together experts working on Indonesia from all over the world to discuss pressing issues facing the country. IS4 is sponsored by the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, the Cornell Southeast Asia Program, and the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies. And today we're additionally sponsored by the University of California, San Diego, and the School of Global Policy and Strategy, where I am based. I'm Sam Bazi. I'm an associate professor of economics at UCSD. I'll be chairing this talk today. And I'm really happy to welcome our speaker and discussant. Our speaker, Arya Gadu, is an associate professor at the Department of Economics at the Sam Walton College of Business at the University of Arkansas. He studies policies related to human and social capital accumulation and urban economics in low and middle income countries. One of his main interests, which we're going to hear about today, is to study how policies can improve student learning outcomes in Indonesia. Arya is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and an affiliate of the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab. Professor Gadu will present for about 25 minutes today. And then we'll hear from our discussant, Christina Brown, who's a development economist studying labor and behavioral economics questions. Her research examines labor and education market imperfections, especially around issues of asymmetric information. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Becker-Friedman Institute and will join the University of Chicago's Department of Economics as an assistant professor in 2023. She received a PhD in economics from UC Berkeley and has worked as a consultant for the World Bank and Save the Children. And prior to working as a researcher, she taught high school physics. Professor Brown will speak for about 10 minutes as part of her discussion. And that's going to leave about 20 minutes for Q&A. So for those in the audience, please do drop questions in the Q&A box, and I'll be sure to moderate those, and we can have hopefully a productive conversation after Christina's discussion concludes. Okay, with that, let me hand it over to Arya for about 25 minutes. Take it away.
Thanks, Sam. So first, I'd like to thank the IS4 organizers for inviting me to this and basically setting up this wonderful forum. And today I'm going to talk about this paper that I did with Menno, Jan, and Dewi. Some of them are actually among the audience, so they can probably also pitch in later on in the Q&A session. Okay, so what we're doing in this paper is basically studying the impact of interventions that try to address a problem of the tyranny of distance in education, right? So even when education is available in many remote areas nowadays, their quality tends to be of lower or sort of lesser quality. And part of the problems is that monitoring and enforcing standards, sort of like school standards, teaching standards in remote areas are difficult. Remote areas being remote means that top-down supervision can be very costly. And because of its remoteness, sometimes the standards, the national standards that are often used to sort of like enforced in these areas often ignore local conditions. So the idea is that in this setting, communities can be in a good position to sort of like monitor and enforce service provision. And this is one of the reasonings behind social accountability interventions, which sort of like we can think of using it as a way to reduce the need for top-down supervisions. However, studies in participatory development have suggested that in education, when parents or communities are weak in terms of their authority relative to schools, or they have weak agencies, impacts tend to be low, and they tend to not persist over time. So as a refresher, what is social accountability? So social accountability strategies are ways to try to improve performance, service performance by strengthening citizen engagement. So they can come into various forms. You can have citizen monitoring. You can have sort of like public information dissemination, some kind of sort of like public complaint or grievance redress mechanisms, as well as things like participatory budgeting, right? Given the problem that we mentioned earlier about weak communities, what we are trying to do here is we want to see if we enhance social accountability interventions with incentive contracts that basically give citizen authority over teacher monetary payments, can it actually strengthen the impact of social accountability? And if so, what should be the basis of the incentive contracts, whether it should be based on some indicator that is simple and verifiable, but maybe incomplete, or should it be based on something that is comprehensive, but often, because it's being evaluated by communities, it's going to be a bit more subjective. So these are the interventions that we tried. So there are 3 interventions. The first intervention is what we call social accountability mechanism, or SAM, is the pure social accountability intervention. And then we add 2 types of incentive contracts for the second and third intervention. The first, which we call SAM plus SCAM, added an incentive contract that is based on teacher presence, in which presence is monitored using tamper-proof camera. And in the third intervention, which we call SAM plus score, the incentive contract is based on scorecards that is monitored by the community. And this sort of like aggregates the comprehensive indicators, which I'll show later, that are put in the scorecards, and those are used to determine teacher incentives. In a sense, our study is what I would call an experiment in the wild, because it uses, or it works with schools that are typical in the regions that we are working in, and it also uses existing resources instead of adding something in, and work with the regular teachers. So we work in the typical and mostly public primary schools. Remote schools here is defined as schools that are 2 hours plus from the sub-district office. We also work with an existing government allowances. This is called teacher special allowance, which is a hardship allowance for eligible teachers in remote and disadvantaged areas, and it goes to its amount is equal to 1 times base salary. And finally, this is an intervention that targets regular teachers, which is the teachers that in public schools often have civil service contracts, instead of contract teachers that can be hired and fired by schools. So this gives, and there is sort of like a study on the sample of population that is most likely encountered when people are thinking about scaling up the interventions. It evaluates the first year impact. That is the impact when the village level project facilitators are still in the village and they left at the end of the first year. And we also look at sustainability 1 year after all the project facilitators has left the villages. So we're working in 5 districts in Indonesia. These are the districts, and in 270 primary schools. I will talk about the timeline later when we talk about data collection. So I'm going to start with how we design the intervention. So the first component of the intervention is SAM, the social accountability, right? And this goes across all 3 interventions. One thing to note is that our social accountability institutional arrangements need to be developed from scratch. So that means that this would require what we believe to be a minimum set of activities that would make a social accountability intervention work, which includes activities that in the literature might be considered sort of like demand side activities. Some would then argue that, our social accountability intervention isn't really a social accountability intervention, but it's an SA plus because you have this other things that you add in as a demand side interventions. We would argue that if we are setting this up in a new context, all the demand side interventions is part of the social accountability interventions that needs to be done in order for the actual monitoring and enforcement to work, right? And what are they? So first, we have to start by raising awareness among the schools communities about learning and the importance of learning. And then we have to develop a service agreement that requires parents to know sort of like the benchmark level, learning level of children, and parents and schools and communities to come together and sort of discuss what they believe to be the roles that each of them should contribute in order to improve learning, and sort of like devise an actual service agreement that incorporates the results of the discussion that can be revised at least once every semester. From this service agreement, we take the teacher component and we constructed a teacher-specific scorecard. The scorecard looks like this. This is done for every single teacher, and it has between 5 to 8 indicators. Each indicator gets a weight, and the weight totals up to 100. The indicator needs to have a presence as one of the indicators, and it will be signed off by the user committee that I will discuss a little bit later. One thing I want to point out is that for each indicator, there is also a set of rubrics that would clarify how the communities want these indicators to be evaluated. So there's this smaller ABCD, if you see on the third column, that gives you sort of like this rubric of how to evaluate. The scorecard applies to all teachers, not just teachers who are receiving the TSA or the allowance. But obviously in the incentive contracts, teachers who are not TSA teachers will not have their income affected by this scorecard. So as I said, the whole accountability is going to be driven by the user committee, who is going to monitor and evaluate the scorecards. This committee comprises 9 members with 3 community leaders and parents from each of the primary school grade, and they will meet monthly. They would meet monthly to discuss scorecard evaluations. In the performance pay / incentive contracts interventions, the user committee is the one that is going to sign up the scores that determine the pay cuts that will be later sent to the district level education office, and then will result in penalties to the TSA that teachers received. So in the second intervention, SAM plus CAM, we add an incentive contract that is based on teacher presence and that is monitored using a tamper-proof camera. So in this intervention, we do all the things that we do in SAM. All indicators are monitored, but only teacher presence will affect or penalize teachers' TSA. The presence is monitored by camera that teachers take themselves, with pictures that teachers take themselves. And there are different types of excuses if you are going to be absent, and each of the excuses or not unexcused absence will result in sort of like a penalty to the present score. So at the end of the month, if the present score is greater or equal than 85%, the teacher will receive that percentage of their teacher special allowances. But if it's below 85%, then teachers will lose their TSA entirely. So this is the idea here, is to try to establish sort of like a norm of acceptable behavior. As I said earlier, if you do not have TSA, you do not receive TSA, then you are not financially affected. The third intervention is sample score. And here, not only all indicators are monitored, but all of the indicators will determine how much TSA the teachers receive. So as I mentioned earlier, you have a score of 100, and the percentage of TSA paid to the TSA recipients will be the percentage score that you get in the scorecard, right? So suppose that you receive a 79 score in your scorecard, you are going to receive 79% of the TSA. Again, non-TSA teachers will not be affected. So as our outcome measures, we consider the primary outcome to be student learning. So we constructed a student learning assessments, which are class-based for grades 3 to 6. And we also conducted sort of like a one-on-one assessment for students grades 1 to 2 to follow sort of like the best practice in the field. We also included an observation-based teacher absence survey. This is conducted during the data collection, where enumerators would come on an unannounced visit and observe whether teachers are present, whether they are working, and so on and so forth. Finally, we also collected teacher, school principal, and parent surveys for other variables. The timeline of the project is the project began in the end of 2016, and by January 2018, the village level project facilitators would leave the villages. So from then on, there is no facilitator to sort of help guide the process of user committee meetings. Baseline was conducted before October 2016. By 2018, after the facilitators left, we conducted the one-year impact evaluation, data collection, and this was conducted for all 3 treatments. We had the opportunity to actually conduct a second data collection, but under a budget constraint. So we used this opportunity to look at sustainability, because this was done basically 1 year after village level facilitators have left their villages. However, because of the budget constraint, we'll limit our data collection to outcomes for the control groups, the SAM and SAM plus CAM. And we also completed the learning assessments for grades 3 to 6. And as I'll present in a few slides, this is going to matter to understand whether there is decay in the impacts or the persistence of the impacts in the program or in these interventions. Okay, so going up to results. So I'm going to start with our primary outcome, which is learning outcomes. These are the mean of grade adjusted standardized math and Indonesian scores. So these are the 2 learning assessments that we measure. And these are grade adjusted, and we take the means for both. What we are finding is that all 3 treatments actually have an impact on learning outcomes, with an impact between 0.08 to 0.2 standard deviation. Sample SCAM yielded the strongest impact on learning. And one thing that we noticed when we conducted the heterogeneity analysis is that impacts tend to be stronger in lower grades. Now, if we want to understand whether there is a first year and second year impact, and whether those impacts are persisted across time, if we use the whole data, then because in the second year we only collected data for grades 3 to 6, we're going to sort of like bias the impact to be lower during the second year, because the effects tend to be stronger in lower grades, right? Because the first and second year, the grade 1 and 2 were not collected in the second year. So to make this sort of like persistence analysis more comparable, we also conducted the same analysis on the impact on math and Indonesian, but we focus on grades 3 to 6 at the time of the measurement. And what we are finding here is that while the impacts essentially declined for SAM, sample SCAM yielded a persistent learning impact over the 2 periods. When we look at the heterogeneity, the effects are gender neutral. There is no differential between boys and girls. It also don't depend on whether you are exposed for multiple years with TSA teachers, but the effects tend to be stronger for students who are better or stronger at baseline, but it is more persistent in schools that are weaker at baseline. Next, we look at the mechanisms. Basically, we sort of like see how our interventions influence or affect parents' teachers, teacher efforts, parents' behavior, and sort of teacher management. In this table, we look at the impact of the interventions on measures that are collected using the teacher absence survey. This is the one where the enumerators conducted an unannounced visit. And this is done for whether teachers were present at the time of the unannounced visit, or whether teachers, when present, are seen to be actually working instead of doing something else, like just sitting around or just, smoking or something like that, right? What we are finding is that in the first year, there is a weak positive but not very persistent impact. We're going to see the second year, but we see a weak positive impact for sample scan. What we also find is that there is a negative impact for teachers in sample score, but this negative impact tends to be driven mostly by the non-TSA teachers. When we look at persistence, we find that by the second year, all of the teacher impacts in sample scan have disappeared, right? So there is weak positive for sample scan, but it's an impact that is not persistent over time. Finally, we look at whether there are impacts on parent investment. Here we are measuring it based on the education expenditures based on the parent survey. We look at education expenditure. We look at the hours that the children in the house are accompanied when learning, and we look at the number of meetings that parents have with teachers. And in general, we find that the impacts tend to be stronger for sample scan, and it also tends to persist for sample scan across all the three parent investment outcome variables. Finally, we look at the impact on teacher management, and here we focus on the principal's evaluation practices. We look at whether principals are whether teacher-reported principals conducting routine evaluation, the frequency of the evaluation, and whether teachers reported that they are being observed while teaching. Across all outcomes, we find teachers are actually reporting increased evaluation by their principal, and all these effects also persisted over the second year period that we observe for SAM and sample scan. So one thing that we find interesting is that why do the different incentive contracts perform differently? So one thing that we establish is that incentive contract will need to rely on the community's willingness to enforce, right? So when I was discussing this idea earlier, a lot of people who study Indonesia had an initial reaction by saying that Indonesians are too nice; they're probably not going to punish, right? So this sort of like lead us to think about maybe there are strategies to show the extent to which communities are willing to punish. So what we did was we conducted a lab experiment in the field for 2/3 of the schools that are balanced across treatment, which is we conducted the public good games with punishment. And then using that, we estimate sort of like the community's willingness to punish, and then we use that as a variable and interacted it with the treatments to look at sort of like the heterogeneous effects. What we find is that if you look at the impact, so the one on the bottom half of the panel will tell you the impacts, how much stronger is the impact compared to of the schools with stronger willingness to punish compared to those with a weaker willingness to punish, right? And what we find is that if you have a stronger communities have a stronger punishing norm, these are the ones that are driving the impact on teacher attendance. And they are also the ones that are primarily driving the greater improvements in learning for the incentive treatments. This is for sample scan and sample score. And the results essentially suggest that if you want the incentive contracts to work, then communities need to be willing to punish sort of like behavior that violates the contract. The second fact in our schools is that the authority of the principal, which is parents, over the agent, which are teachers, are relatively weak in these remote communities. So about 70% of parents are primary school educated, and therefore teachers often put pressure on the user committees to try to sort of like not punish them strong enough in scoring their performance, right? And we have qualitative evidence on this, but we also have some sort of like reports from the user committees that suggest that this is comparing with respect to the SAM treatment, and there are much significantly different level or share of user committees reporting pressure to increase scores and threats for low scores in SAM plus score, but not as much in SAM plus CAP. So this provides suggestive evidence that giving a simple, easier to verify indicator allows for easier handling of the incentive contract, right? Because it's simple and objective verifiable, it reduces the potential of conflict and avoids what this Falk and Coswell paper called the hidden cost of control, where teachers felt that the communities are too controlling of things that teachers might know better compared to the communities, right? So I want to point out that our results that the objective contracts or the objective indicators perform better is contrast with Christina's paper with Tahir Andrabi in Pakistan in private urban setting, where the evaluator are school principals. And we think this has to do with the fact that school principals have much stronger authority relative to the teachers compared to communities relative to the teachers. But this is, I think, something that would be interesting as a part of the future research. So to conclude, performance pay can enhance and sustain community monitoring, positive impact on learning in remote schools. The impacts come from both the supply and demand side. There is persistent improvements in parent investing and principal monitoring, and community empowerment can be effective when parents have concrete power to exert change. In terms of the incentive contracts, the simpler indicators seems to work better because it seems to reduce conflict and increase the legitimacy. And what we also find, and I didn't discuss this, is that sustaining impacts on teacher efforts seem to need additional interventions, because it seems that the schools and teachers seem to work together to sort of like, adjust in the second period to try to minimize potentially internal conflict within schools in terms of what is being reported in the presence and all the various indicators. So as an epilogue, sort of like a heartening conclusion to this paper, we worked with 5 districts, and some of the work was interrupted by COVID, and we didn't actually have the follow-up projects that we planned, but at least 2 out of the 5 districts continued the implementation of this scheme without any project support from the outside. So we are happy with the fact that the district governments find this intervention to be something that is useful to implement on their own. Thanks. That's it.
All right. Thanks very much, Arya, for ending on an encouraging note as well. Let's hand it over to Christina now. If you could unshare your slides, and perfect. So Christina, you'll have about 10 minutes. And for those in the audience, please do drop questions in the Q&A. You can start putting them in there at any point, and I'll moderate them after the discussion. Okay, so please do chip in with thoughts and questions, and we'll get that discussion going in a little bit. Christina, take it away.
Great. So First off, it was just so enjoyable to read this paper. I think especially if there's any grad students on the webinar, I think this is a really fantastic example of just like someone who's gone through and thought of everything in terms of data collection and other kind of unique little like some of the lab evidence and all these different things that were measured. It's just, yeah, 25 minutes doesn't do it justice. So I will start with that. Definitely read it. And in terms of contribution, I think what's really nice about this paper is that it speaks to a few different issues in the kind of personnel contract theory literature about what works in terms of performance pay, in terms of management, thinking about these kind of principal agent problems. I think this trade-off of being able to show the effects of a more objective versus a more subjective style of performance pay, as well as focus more on inputs in terms of presence versus things maybe more related to outcomes in terms of the score, where they're being evaluated on a more broad sense of what teachers are accomplishing. So again, I think it's a really nice example of these types of papers. In terms of the discussion, what I wanted to do was just kind of take a step back and think a little bit about, we have these set of results in terms of the effects for these two different types of incentives, and as well as the really interesting heterogeneity results showing that like in what context it seems like certain incentives work better than others. And so I thought it would be helpful to just kind of, go back to undergrad level kind of moral hazard model and think through, can we rationalize these results that we're seeing through that standard model? What are the mechanisms that we think might be explaining it? And then also, hopefully, this gives us some ideas for either, maybe future analysis to do with this data, but also, potentially additional research questions. So just very briefly, as a quick refresher, when we think about the kind of standard moral hazard model, we think of some agent that's producing some outcome. So let's say this is something like student learning, and it's going to be a function of all the different things that the teacher does. So maybe E1 here is how much time they spend on lesson planning. E2 is how much time they spend meeting with parents, and there's all these different actions they can take. And each different action has some return to that particular action. And then there's all the things that are outside of the teacher's control, which affects student learning. So, maybe this is parental investment, maybe this is the infrastructure of the school that the teacher themselves doesn't have control over, and so on. And then when we think about performance pay, P here is the pay that this agent would be receiving. And they're effectively going to be given like a piece rate for each of the different actions that they provide. So maybe there's a piece rate for the time that they spend on lesson planning. And in the case of, for example, the CAM, SAM plus CAM, the piece rate on lesson planning potentially would be 0, right? This is an action that they're taking outside of school potentially, and so it wouldn't really factor into the performance pay that they're getting. But then there's all these other components of their effort, and there might be different piece rates for those different components. And then lastly, there's going to be this term phi, which is everything outside the teacher's control that still affects their pay. So maybe in the case of SAM plus score, maybe there were things that they were being evaluated on in the score that they really just didn't have control over. They couldn't affect it for whatever reason, and so that could still affect their pay. And with this simple model, the two main channels that we think of that could affect the how effective a performance pay contract is the correlation between F and G. So you can think of this as basically, are you paying more? So do you have a higher piece rate for the actions which also are more productive, that have a higher return on student learning? And the noisiness of the contract. So how much of the pay that the person is receiving is outside of their control. So then going back to the paper, how can we use this framework to think a little bit about why certain treatments might have worked versus didn't? Well, we know that, first off, in order for a contract to work, teachers need to believe that their actions will affect their pay. So for example, under the SAM plus score, I'd be really interested to see what were these scores correlated with? So what types of actions were predictive of that score? Either explicitly because they were criteria, or more implicitly because that's how the SAM ended up kind of using the scoring setup. Also, in the case that we kind of saw, it looked like there were some like kind of grade inflation in the scores too. It could be that, teachers' actions really weren't correlated with the scores, because they kind of knew, hey, if I bug the parents enough, they'll end up bumping my score up. And so, there really isn't a relationship between teacher behavior in the classroom and the score, because they knew they could kind of get it inflated. Similarly, are there certain types of inputs, like it looks like we saw, treatment effects across the board on meetings with parents. And so maybe it was those types of inputs that ended up being really important in affecting their score. The other thing that I think would be interesting is to understand, basically how much information did committee members actually have about teacher effort? So when they're doing this scoring, how accurate are their beliefs about what's happening in the classroom? Because again, even if they're prioritizing the right actions, if they don't have great information about what's happening, like in the case of SAM plus CAM, they had physical evidence. They had hard evidence to be able to, at least get a measure of presence accurate. Whereas in the score setup, it might have been really hard for them to assess these other components. And so, they might have had incorrect beliefs about the accuracy. And then in terms of, so Arya pointed this out too, kind of reconciling this with other papers in the literature, I think exactly as he pointed out, one thing that really matters in terms of comparing this to other subjective incentives is one, the information that the evaluator has, so the principal versus the school committee, how accurate they are, but also, as he said, what their ability is to actually enforce this contract, what was the level of kind of authority within the system. So I think that really, might reconcile the two sets of results. On the other mechanism in the moral hazard model, the distortion component, the other thing that I think would be really helpful to think a little bit more about is, what are the types of actions that are easiest for teachers to improve? So, what are the things where it's a really low cost of effort to change? And what is that effect on student outcomes? So one thing that I saw was, interesting is that even though the SAM plus CAM had an effect on test scores, we don't really see much of an effect on actual presence. So it wasn't that this was necessarily getting them to show up for more days of work, but maybe once they were there was this pressure to kind of, actually teach once they were there or something. So there's, kind of an interesting dynamic in terms of what was the kind of marginal action for teachers here, and what does that look like then in terms of effects on student outcomes. The other thing that would be interesting too is to know, like, what are the types of inputs or outcomes that parents really valued. I'd be really curious to understand, from the parents' perspective, like, what is it that they're trying to maximize? Is it test scores, or is it students, behavioral management, that they're respectful? What are the things that, if I as a parent am trying to evaluate a teacher, the things that I think are going to be most important? And so, even if they were asked to evaluate a teacher on certain criteria, they might be inputting their own values and preferences in that evaluation process. And so I think that would just be really interesting data collection for future work. And then lastly, I think this point that came up too about this kind of grade inflation, or the fact that there wasn't a budget constraint on the committee members in the SAM plus score treatment, I think is really, really interesting, and pushes us to think a little bit about, should we be thinking about the committee members as the principal in terms of like a principal agent problem, or are they really more of a fellow agent, right? What preferences are they maximizing, and is that closer to the, social welfare planner versus the agents closer to the teacher's preferences, for example. And I think there could be a few reasons why their preferences might look more similar to the teacher's preferences. One, just as kind of came up, there could just be, disutility from punishment. They don't want to get nagged at. They don't want, if their student is in that teacher's classroom, maybe there could be retaliation for the child. They're also, having to work with these teachers, presumably as part of being on the committee. And so if they're having to see these teachers every month, it might be really uncomfortable to give them low scores because you want to kind of, increase the cooperation in the long run. The other thing too is, especially since there's pretty minimal oversight, from a purely rational economic perspective, you can imagine that from the committee members' perspective, they should just say, I'm going to report that you got a perfect score, we get the full amount of money, and then we can split the surplus or do something like that. I think it's probably would take a lot of effort to set up some sort of collusive arrangement like that. But there could be forces that push in that direction, especially maybe after the policy has been in place a while and people kind of understand some of the ways to game some of these approaches. And then lastly, kind of back to the previous slide, is I'd be really interested to understand what goes into these committee members' utility functions. How much are they thinking about maximizing student outcomes versus the cost or effort that they have to put into doing evaluation or that they have to do in monitoring. All of these kinds of things, I think would be really interesting to understand. And then lastly, just a few ideas for future work. I think that this idea, the fact that we see the kind of split in attendance, where there's some negative attendance on the non-incentivized teachers and some small positive effects on the incentivized teachers. It could be maybe that within the school system, they're splitting the duties. If one has election duty or one has, something else that they need to do, are they basically, coordinating amongst the incentivized versus non-incentivized teachers? I think that would be really interesting to think a little bit more about kind of the teamwork and spillovers that happen within the school itself. And then in the second year effects, we do seem to find some interesting dynamics, and I'd be curious, is it that they're, better able to kind of learn about the ins and outs of this incentive structure? Is it that this kind of relationship between the committee members and teachers, they have such a strong relationship that it's really hard for them to then penalize teachers at that point? All of those interesting dynamics as the relationships develop, I think would be very interesting to see. And I'd also be really curious to see what happens to non-test score student outcomes in terms of, socio-emotional skills, graduation rates, all of these kinds of things I think would be really interesting for future work. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Christina. So Arya, do you want to take a minute or two to reply to some of the comments and let some of the audience add more questions in the Q&A? Please don't be shy and we'll get that conversation going. But Arya, if you want to take a couple minutes.
Okay, thanks so much, Christina. I think these are really excellent comments. It gets me thinking about a lot of things that we might want to start sort of studying and reanalyzing. So in terms of noise, the question of noise, we do have sort of like the scores, and we have teachers sort of like hours spent doing the various activities, and we have done some kind of correlation exercises. I want to first caveat our analysis here is because the surveys are done at the very end, but the scores are conducted multiple periods, right? And what we have at the end, we can't really say who causes what because it has become endogenous and like all this stuff. But what we are finding is that it seems that scores associated with teaching in class, doing teaching activities, adding intracurricular activities, seems to be correlated with a higher hours spent in teaching activities. but there aren't that many other sort of like effects. But again, like this is highly qualified because we only have one outcomes, but multiple scores leading to that outcome, right? So at the end of the day, some kind of equilibrium that we might need to think very carefully about. We will go back to the survey question and try to look at sort of like this question about user committee / parents priority. I think we might have some questions in the survey that we can examine and look, or we can even use the scores and the weights that they assign to look at what parents prioritize. Of course, the scores itself is a result of a discussion. Remember that it's in the beginning, it's a discussion between parents and communities and schools. So that might be sort of like endogenous. We'll try to see whether there are other questions in the instruments that we can dig in to answer that question. I like this question about the potential gaming between UC and teachers. We haven't analyzed that, but what we did analyze is we find that in the second year, the school principals tend to give out more excuses for absence. So there seems to be like, I think Banerjee et al. Has this paper about nurses that suggests that the hospital administrators try to give more excuses to allow sort of this more absenteeism. We find a similar type of responses from the principals, presumably because they really probably want to minimize internal strife within the school, right? But we haven't really thought about this potential collusion between UC and teachers. In terms of non-test score student outcomes, that would be lovely. I don't think we have that many non-student outcomes, but I think if we have future projects on this, this will be something that we really should seriously consider adding. Thanks so much, Christina.
Great. So there's one question in the Q&A. Please do keep those coming. Let's start with that, and then I have a few questions that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So the question from the Q&A is, could you couple the SAM plus CAM intervention with some sort of loss aversion by removing pay if the teachers don't satisfy parental expectations and don't fulfill their participation requirements?
So the current setup is about loss, right? So the current setup isn't that you are getting extra money if you come more often, but this is the setup in which this is your entitled allowance for every absence. You are actually losing your pay. So this, there is this evidence. I think Fryer has this evidence that this type of interventions seems to be more effective than the other way around, where you are basically adding bonuses for each additional good performance that you get, right? So this is already incorporated in the design of the intervention itself.
And so, sorry, on that, is that in part why you guys chose that removal rather than boosting pay? Because of that prior evidence? I was actually, I was curious about this, yeah.
Both that and the fact that that's probably politically more acceptable than the other way around, right? Because we are actually working with an unconditional TSA prior to the project. And there it's much harder to say, hey, you're going to get additional stuff. Mm-hmm. It's probably easier to say for everybody, either the government who's giving the money and probably the teachers as well, to explain that, hey, if you are not doing very well, we're going to start reducing what you get.
Right. I see. Okay. Okay. So I have a couple questions that hopefully we can answer. So the first one is very easy. I was just curious where how to think about the weights in the report, in the scorecards. Like, how important were those choices, and like who made them, and are they going to be malleable in the future? Just kind of a very practical question, but one that could be, pretty important for thinking about a few different margins here.
So the weights are is part of the initial discussion. So those can be revised once every semester. Both the weights and the indicators could be revised once every semester. So in our case, what's interesting is in the beginning, so this might answer some of your questions about what parents prioritize. Christina, in the first set of scorecard, a lot of parents are worried about corporal punishment of students getting hit. They want teachers to stop doing that, right? In the first revision, a lot of those requirements are dropped because apparently teachers complained that, to say it bluntly, your children is unruly and I can't deal with them without hitting or whatever, right? So this seems to be something that's acceptable in communities and so on and so on. So you can see that these revisions allow for both parties to provide.
But so in the very beginning though, did you guys set like some suggested weights, or these were literally like at the will of each group?
No, this is at the will of each group.
Okay.
I want to try to remember if we actually required, but we require presence to be there. I don't remember if we require a minimum weight for presence.
Okay.
But for the others, they are all open. They are all open for.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And then I was curious, like, why you think SAM plus CAM is inducing so much more parental investment and effort. That seemed to be like a really important part of this. And I was wondering if it had something to do with like the punishment and kind of ability for parental collective action in these communities. And so like a very simple question, I guess, would be in that like the heterogeneity split on above, below, median punishment in the lab game, like do you find differential parental effort in areas where there's a greater ability for or greater kind of punishment norms?
Oh, that's a good question. We haven't actually done that, but I think we should do it. This is a speculation. We don't have strong evidence in terms of why the parental responses are different between treatments. But the speculation is that in sample score, you introduce a lot of stakeholder conflicts between the different parties, right?
Mm-hmm.
You introduce less of that in the other one, and that might, for some reason, be driving some of this negative results to the parents as well. But again, this is speculation. The only evidence that we clearly have is that sample score induces conflicts, but this might be one of the reasons why that has come around.
I see. Cool. And then one more kind of impact question, and then just a couple questions about like thinking about the future and scaling and so on. So why I didn't, maybe I missed this, like why are the impacts stronger in lower grades? Do you have a sense of what's driving that?
So that's a good question, and I don't think the literature has a good answer to that. So a lot of education studies seem to have this similar pattern that you have primary school treatments, you have a stronger impact in lower grades compared to the higher grades, right? Maybe it's because once you get to the higher grades, the complementarity between teachers and parents becomes smaller because the parents no longer are able to sort of like support whatever teacher effort you have. But that would be something that's interesting to explore further in a separate question. But that seems to be the pattern that we are observing in a lot of primary school studies.
Okay, yeah, oh, that's really interesting. Okay, in the last couple of minutes, I was really curious about the fact that you've got two of the districts that are just continuing this after you guys left without kind of any, what sounded like very little effort on your part to encourage that. And I'm just curious, like what you know about what they're retaining versus changing about the program, like what's happening in terms of their process, and what you might be able to learn about future efforts of this sort based on just their kind of revealed actions after you guys departed.
Okay, so for this, I need to give a setup of the story, right? So at the end of our project, the districts were actually interested to continue only the sample scan. So they know that sample scan was the best. So everybody wants to continue sample scan, right? And we were setting up to do a follow-up study in which instead of using project facilitators, we want to use institutions that existed, like the school, maybe PNPM facilitators, or something that does not come from the project, right? And then COVID hits. COVID hits, and a lot of this becomes moot because a lot of the sort of like parent-student interaction, whatever, requires that they meet, right? So even though, and at that point, we basically left, but two of the districts actually continued. And this, we didn't know, they didn't come to us and talk about it. We just knew from asking questions like, oh, do you know that this districts and this district are actually still keeping up? And one of the districts actually come up with a district regulation to sort of like provide a legal basis for this implementation. So we would, thanks for the question. I think we're going to try to dig in a little bit more, whether, how is this the quality of the education, the district education office? What are the types of things that are driving these results for the two districts?
Great. So just one final quick question. I'm just curious, like, are there, and I should know this having worked in Indonesia for a long time, but are there powerful teachers unions, or are they just, is that not a thing in this context? Like, what are teachers doing collectively to potentially, or think about in these two districts now that it's going to be permanent moving forward? Like, what are the dynamics on the kind of teacher collective action side?
I have a sense that this project aren't in the radars. So the national teacher associations are strong, right? But I have a sense that this project, because it's only working on five districts, and it's framed as a study, they are not inside the radars of the national association. On the other hand, the teachers that we survey, they reported that they're satisfied with. So there is no negative satisfaction in terms of job satisfaction, in terms of happiness with the district governments, and so on and so forth. So the teachers themselves are happy. So this is consistent actually with research results on how teachers in the US reflect performance pay, but not the association, right? The association are unhappy about it.
Right.
The fact that we are working with remote teachers also might have something to do with it, because they are usually the marginals, right?
Yeah.
And that might explain why we didn't get as much pushback overall from the teacher association, national and local.
Got it. Great. Well, we're out of time, but let me just thank you both again for a wonderful talk and wonderful discussion. I learned a lot. I hope our audience did too. And thank you once again for joining us for this latest installment of the Indonesia Social Science Seminar Series. Please continue checking in on future events, and we'll hope to see you in the coming months. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.
Thanks a lot.